Now 1:01 p.m. I would like to call to order this meeting of the WIFA Long-Term Water Augmentation Committee. Director, please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Here.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Mr. Beckham, Mr. Davis, Mr. Kim.
Here.
Mr. Lunt,
Present.
Ms. Montgomery, Mr. Tomyer.
Here.
Thank you. And Chairman Cook.
Here.
Mr. Chair, quorum is present.
Thank you. For the record, please remember to identify yourself when making a motion or requesting to speak, and please ensure you are unmuted for any votes. In addition, if any member wishes to depart the meeting at any time, please announce your departure for our recorded meeting minutes. I do note that we have one committee member, Mr. Kim, that may need to leave the meeting a little bit later. Moving to agenda item number 2, disclosure of conflicts of interest. Has WIFA staff received any disclosures?
Good afternoon, Joe Satelli, General Counsel. No disclosures have been submitted for today's meeting.
If any committee member would like to identify and disclose a conflict for any item on today's agenda, please do so at this time. Hearing none, we'll move to agenda item number 3, the director's report, and I will pass it over to WIFA's director, Chelsea McGuire, to lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cook. I just wanted to take this opportunity to not necessarily update anything, but remind everyone, the public included, about where we are in this process. As committee and as staff, I think it's easy for us to go forward in these conversations with the big picture in mind. We're kind of steeped in both big picture and the nuance. But for members of the public or stakeholders or others who haven't been kind of eating, breathing, sleeping this like we have, this is hopefully a good reminder of what WIFA is doing and what our ultimate goal looks like. So on this slide, which I admit is difficult to read, that's why the QR code is there. So if you are here and using your mobile device, feel free to use that to go to our long-term augmentation solicitation landing page. But on the slide, you see our 3-phased approach to augmentation project selection and development. These phases really represent a balance between the confidentiality that's required by a competitive procurement for large-scale infrastructure and the transparency that's required to ensure that this project is sustainable and beneficial and feasible. Right now, WIFA is squarely in phase 1 of the procurement through the solicitation. The goal of the solicitation isn't to select a project. The goal of the solicitation is to identify teams who are capable financially, politically, technically, and all of the above of bringing a large-scale project online. Today, the committee is going to hear an update on the status of the initial qualification submittals, and through the rest of the spring, we'll continue working our way through the solicitation, ultimately to identify successful teams who will proceed to a feasibility analysis in phase 2. In phase 2, WIFA will direct those successful teams to analyze various aspects of their proposed water importation projects. That's going to include the financial, the environmental, the social, political, the technical feasibility of those projects. WIFA will provide compensation to those teams for all the work that they're going to do that they will be required to do for that analysis. But unlike the solicitation, unlike phase 1, which necessarily brings with it requirements for confidentiality to maintain the integrity of the competition, phase 2 is going to be what I've called many times an exercise in public sausage making. Every aspect of that analysis is going to include opportunities for the public to hear from the teams, to assess the information that they provide, and to comment on that information in front of the WIFA board in a way that truly makes it so that the public is influencing the future decisions that WIFA makes. In addition, that process is going to allow WIFA to utilize the project teams themselves to evaluate multiple concepts at the same time. That's consistent with the way projects are analyzed through such as the federal NEPA process. It's also going to allow WIFA to select from the widest possible pool of solutions when we're determining which of those projects move to phase 3, where we may ultimately decide to implement a pre-development agreement after the feasibility analysis. The most common feedback that I get when I'm describing this process is that seems really complex or that seems very convoluted. Honestly, that's to be expected when you're undertaking something as monumental as the task that WIFA is undertaking, right? This process, though, is really developed and really designed to ensure that not only can WIFA prove that we are investing public resources in the best possible water solutions for the state, It also ensures that all stakeholders, from the potential off-takers to impacted communities to the general public, have a meaningful opportunity to influence that investment in ways that I think will ultimately strengthen the outcome. It's not always easy to follow all of the work that WIFA has done and is doing on this issue, and I highly admit that. So I thought this was a good opportunity to just take a few minutes, try to distill it down into a more digestible format, while also encouraging everyone on this call and in the audience to say thank you and to continue paying attention to what we're doing. This really is just the beginning. We truly are in phase one of a multi-phase process. So I really appreciate everyone's engagement and the way that ensures the success of our program. And of course, this is also my standard reminder that if you want to know more, scan the QR code or go to ltwaf.wifa.gov. They'll give you everything you need to know. Mr. Chair, that's all I had.
Thank you, Director McGuire. So now we're moving to our regular agenda. And before that, though, an announcement: members of the public wanting to speak on a specific item on the regular agenda may request to speak prior to opening discussion on that item. For instructions on how to submit a speaker's card, please refer to the notes on proceedings at the end of the meeting agenda. Agenda item number 4, long-term water augmentation solicitation update. And I will turn it back over to Director McGuire to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. I actually, from here, will turn it to Brenda Prevost, so our solicitation officer, who is the brains and the control of the solicitation from here, and I'll let her update the public and the committee.
Thank you, Director McGuire. Under purchase solicitation for procurement, initial qualification submittals were due on February 6th. As a reminder, the initial qualification submittals are the method through which potential proposers identify the makeup of their proposed project team and identify those prior. The proposed.
It's behind you.
Thank you. Thank you. The purpose of the initial qualification submittal is to enable WIFA to determine which project teams have demonstrated the minimal qualifications necessary to move on to the next phase of the procurement and submit an offer for evaluation. In accordance with AAC R18-15-808C, WIFA disclosed the names of the proposers who submitted an initial qualification submittal. The list of the names were included with the publicly available board materials for February 19th WIFA's board meetings. As of 12:50 today, I've notified all the proposers of their status as either qualified or non-qualified. In accordance with WIFA's policy 11.19, I've prepared an offer report in the form of a memo documenting my evaluation of the initial qualification submittals and their responsiveness or non-responsiveness. Although the committee does not play a role in evaluating the initial qualification submittals, staff committed to providing updates to the committee at various stages during the procurement. Because this memo is confidential and pursuant to AAC R18-15-808, I'd suggest the committee meet in executive session to discuss records exempt by law from public inspection and for the purpose of obtaining legal advice from legal counsel as authorized under ARS 38-431.03 A, 2, and 3.
Thank you, Ms. Prevost. Based on the advice of staff, I'd entertain a motion to enter into executive session for agenda item number 4 pursuant to ARS 38-431.03A2 to discuss confidential information and pursuant to ARS 38-431.03A3 to receive legal advice. Do we have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, Richard Nunn, I would so move.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Mr. Chair, this is Pete Kim. Second.
Is there any committee member discussion before going into executive session? With no further discussion, we will call for a vote to go into executive session. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I only heard 2.
I saw Tim as well.
Aye.
Thank you. And I'll vote aye. Any opposed? Any abstained? The motion passes. For the record, I will note that the following individuals will be joining us in the executive session. Garrett Corral to provide technical support, General Counsel Joe Satelli to provide legal support, Director Chelsea McGuire, Assistant Director of Finance Denise Olson, Procurement Officer Brenda Prevost, and Jason Ford from HDR, all as technical advisors and consultants. We're moving to executive session.
Board members, I will note executive session Teams link should be on your calendar and in your email. Please leave the Zoom and join us on the Teams.
It is now 1:40 p.m. and we are back in regular session. Director McGuire, please call the roll.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beckham, Mr. Davis, Mr. Kim.
Here.
Mr. Lunt,
Here.
Ms. Montgomery, Mr. Tomier,
Here.
Mr. Cook.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, a quorum is confirmed.
Thanks.
In executive session, the committee had an opportunity to view Procurement Officer Prevost's report documenting the evaluation of the initial qualification submittals. This report will be placed in the procurement file and will remain confidential until the procurement closes. The committee would like to thank everyone who responded to this solicitation so far, and we are looking forward to receiving proposals from qualified proposers in the next stage of the procurement. For the general public, we thank you for understanding as WIFA continues to evaluate responses to the solicitation. A list of all teams who submit proposals in the next round of the solicitation will be made public once it is available. The committee is dedicated to being as transparent as possible within the confines of competitive and confidential procurement process. And as a reminder, the solicitation is to identify the team or teams WIFA will contract with to develop an augmentation project or projects. The committee fully expects potential augmentation projects to be publicly vetted once these teams have been selected. Does the committee have any additional questions for WIFA staff appropriate for open session? Okay. Do we have any requests for public comment on this item?
Mr. Chair, we do not.
Okay, then we will be moving to agenda item number 5, offtake agreement engagement strategies, and Director McGuire will lead the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the things that we have talked about relatively extensively is parallel processes for the long-term water augmentation fund. So we recognize that while we are developing and identifying a project, there are other aspects of this too. We've talked about it in the context of what we call a 3 rivers slide. Maybe that's a little bit of a cheeky way to describe it. But what we're talking about when we talk about the solicitation and competitive project development is asking the question, can we build it? Is there a project out there to be built? Then there's another river. There's a parallel process of, can such a project be permitted? Is it possible? Does it make sense within our regulatory structure? But then there's a third river of, can we actually deliver the water from that project? And that's not necessarily a physical question. That is more of a question of demand. Is there demand for the augmented water? Who has that demand? And who has the capital? Who has the financing to be able to meet that demand? This third river is one that I think we have been talking about. We have discussed it. We have kind of touched on it, but we have not as an entity really begun meaningfully to undertake that discussion. In fall of 2023, so late in the year in 2023, we did conduct a needs assessment of potential users of the water. You've heard information about that needs assessment. We used that needs assessment to determine the target for this committee, for this project of between 100,000 and 500,000 acre feet. So we have had those discussions. We have identified a need for the water. But now I believe comes the time for us to start talking about more seriously and more intentionally with potential purchasers of that water. And what does a world look like in which there's an agreement that they want to be part of to actually agree to purchase that water? So today we're talking about that in the context, of an offtake agreement. I know that most of you know what that means, but I always want to make sure that everyone's on the same page for these discussions before we begin them. So when I use the term offtake agreement, when we use that term in the context of this project, what we mean is an agreement to buy or sell water that isn't yet available. We mean an agreement that sets out the terms of future purchases of water from a long-term water augmentation project. WIFA does not have a preconceived notion of an offtake structure that will work best for this project. And that's actually not a bug. That is a feature of this. We do not want to come into this in a world where we are sort of providing a take it or leave it scenario for potential off-takers. We also recognize that we can't really have that preconceived notion right now because there's too many questions that need to be answered first. Some of those questions will be answered by the WIFA board. What are their preferences for how WIFA will operate and what our role in a potential project looks like? Some of those questions will be answered by project proponents through the competitive project development process. What is necessary for their proposals to bring a project online with the assurances that there is a demand for the water? But what we need to do now, what we need to begin in earnest, is engaging the third point on this triangle, and that's the likely purchasers, the off-takers themselves. We have to ask them what structures, what agreements are necessary to facilitate their participation, financially and otherwise, in a water importation project. To do that, we are going to rely and turn it over to our friends at HDR, because we are not the first to have these kinds of questions when it comes to a major infrastructure project, and not the first to have these questions when it comes to a water project. We have many examples that we can pull from. We have many stakeholder processes that we can look at, that we can say what worked well in engaging stakeholders, what worked well in the ultimate structure of those offtake agreements. So we've asked our friends at HDR to go through some of those with their expertise. So at this point, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it to Blaine Dwyer. I'm going to give him the slide advancer so that he can give us that presentation.
Thank you, Director McGuire. For the record, my name is Blaine Dwyer, and I'm with HDR Engineering. And I was asked to figure out how to advance it quicker.
Should just be the green button.
Okay, so what I was asked to do was review with you some of the typical kinds of processes that have been used on other projects and programs for water supply projects. So often the case studies we looked at showed that sponsoring agencies, and we're referring to WIFA in this case as an example of a sponsoring agency, initially form advisory groups to do exactly the kinds of things that Director McGuire just talked about in terms of getting their input on how best to structure a project or program, considering at the end of the day, they'll be the ones that actually purchase the water as a result of development of the project. And looking at these samples, we see they usually tend to form something equivalent to an advisory committee to provide that input. And as a project or program continues to evolve and those project participants or off-takers start to be assume roles, for example, of providing funding, then they want more engagement in the decision-making processes in developing those projects. In other words, they want to know, they want to have more say in how their contribution, their monetary contribution to the project would work. And then they transition to something more like I would call a steering committee. So it's more than just providing advice. Management decisions are made collaboratively with those participants. And again, that's driven by funding. Or another way to look at it is from, in this case, if private developers are engaged in developing these programs, they typically like to see that the eventual purchasers of the water really are invested in the project, that they will be there at the end of the day. So they like to see those participants provide financing and show that long-term support. So we looked at this in terms of how does the off-taker engagement process fit in with the phases of project development. So kind of think of this graphic as climbing the ladder. So we started off with the needs assessment that Director McGuire talked about. We engaged a lot of potential stakeholders, including the ones that might be most likely to actually be off-takers in the project, not just stakeholders. Those fact-finding kind of conversations are continuing as WIFA just issued this first solicitation for project development teams. So if this kind of typical process is continued, then the next step might be developing an advisory group under some kind of agreement, potentially a partnering charter to define how the potential off-takers interface with WIFA as a sponsoring entity. As the project development process on the left side of the chart progresses towards phase 3, where the pre-development agreements are developed, then that's when maybe the participants become more funding participants also and transition into a more of a steering committee arrangement. And then eventually, as the project progresses up towards development, then the final off-taker agreements. So let's look at some case studies. We put together 4 that we think are illustrative to share with you today. The first one we thought would be illustrative because it's close to home. And in this case, it's underway in terms of engaging the potential off-takers. As I'm sure you know, Salt River Project operates the Bureau Reclamation Bartlett Reservoir. The idea on the table is to increase the capacity of that reservoir from about 177,000 acre-feet currently to 650,000 acre-feet. So in 2021, a memorandum of understanding was signed between 24 entities, SRP, and 23 participants. And that process facilitates developing the non-federal cost share that would be divided among the participants on a pro rata basis based on what volume of that increased storage each entity signed up for. So we thought it was an interesting example because there's that potential that some of the participants in the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund program would be also participants in the Bartlett program and bring lessons learned from that program that could benefit WIFA as it engages off-takers for the Long-Term Water Augmentation program. The next one is a project in Colorado. It involves a new 360-foot high dam to form a 90,000 acre-foot reservoir adjacent to an existing Bureau of Reclamation reservoir called Carter Lake. It is now under construction. It got through finally the planning, permitting, design, and especially the NEPA compliance process and should be completed this year, and they hope to start the reservoir filling this fall. So the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District is the sponsoring agency here, and they kind of led the program for 12 participating water agencies within their regional service area. They, on the other hand, had an arrangement already set up with these entities because those entities were participants in the construction of the original Windy Gap project that was built in the 1980s. So in this case, the Northern Water Conservancy District had already set up a municipal sub-district underneath the board of directors of the Northern Board. The board members are one and the same, but it's a separate legal entity for the municipal subdistrict to develop this project. And that may or may not be something, a structure that might be considered, or something similar to it for the long-term water augmentation fund program. It's also, like WIFA, Northern could be looked at as a sponsoring agency, because they are not an end user of water. They're a wholesale water supplier. It's also similar in the sense that non-federal water is introduced into the federal system, conveyed through that federal system to the new dam and reservoir, then taken back out of that dam and reservoir and reintroduced back into the existing federal project. So they ended up doing not one, but two separate compliance processes for the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. One for the construction of the dam and reservoir, and one for the federal approvals to convey the non-federal water back into the project. So as their program for getting the permitting done for the dam and reservoir looked like it was headed towards success, then they started the EIS process for what they call the carriage contract, for the carriage of water through the federal system. So that may be a similarity with some of the concepts that have been brought up previously to WIFA for the Water Augmentation Fund program. The next one, there's not a lot of examples in the water supply space of privately developed water supply projects to deliver water to multiple municipal agencies. So in this case, Poseidon did a public-private partnership, a P3, to supply water to member agencies of the San Diego County Water Authority. In this arrangement, Poseidon assumed all the permitting, development, construction, and operations risks. The water agencies were, however, subject to cost escalations as expanded features needed to be added to the project in order to obtain the environmental permits. Yes, Director Lund.
So they expand the dams, and whoever the partnerships that expanded the dam, I guess that's on top of the arrangements that are already there. Now, on paper, I have stored up here at the dam 1,000 acre feet, let's say, or 100,000.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have the distribution to get it down to where I need it, how is that handled?
Well, in the case of the Windy Gap Firming project, that infrastructure already exists because they were just adding storage to an existing system. Go ahead, Director.
So the transmission from where the water's stored to where they need it, it exists already. It's capable.
I misunderstood as I was focusing on the dam and reservoir. In the Poseidon case, it's going from a wastewater reclamation plant owned by Los Angeles County Sanitation, and they needed to build new infrastructure to pump and pipe that water to the end users. And, each one, so think of it as a trunk line with separate lines that go off to the delivery points for each member agency of the San Diego County Water Authority. So Poseidon took on that also with the involvement, of course, of those member agencies, especially in terms of things like developing right-of-way, et cetera. Under California law, then those member agencies have formed what in California is called the Joint Power Authority, with the goal of purchasing from Poseidon that water delivery infrastructure so that they're responsible and make sure that the future maintenance is kept up on that system. And the concept is that they already own and operate water delivery pipelines, so it would be more efficient for them to do it.
Okay, thank you. I don't need to get us out the weeds, but I expand question just a little bit, and maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of before you are in the presentation, because I know what the next one is here. And this though I think is important for our committee to understand, that because it is likely that that some of the projects that WIFA may develop for water augmentation will have to use existing infrastructure. So I know, of course, how it works with Central Arizona Project and the system use agreement, but I'm guessing that there's something similar in place for both Windy Gap and Bartlett Dams. There's already current users that are using and paid for that infrastructure once, and now there's this new non-project supply, non-federal supply in the case of Windy Gap, and maybe it's the same thing for Bartlett that is also using this infrastructure. So delineating what space belongs to whom and who gets to go first, and what extra costs are might be incurred and who has to bear those, and all of those type of things are part of in the case of Windy Gap, the second permitting process of taking the non-project, non-federal storage out and just distributing it through the existing system.
That's exactly right. And so in the Windy Gap case, the delivery system that was originally owned by Reclamation and went through a title transfer from federal ownership to ownership by the Northern Water District, then conveys that newly developed, that water that then gets stored in the new dam and reservoir. So that infrastructure already existed, but the agreements that the municipal subdistrict had to put in place were to define, well, what if two entities want to pull water out of storage at the same time? Think of a drought year, right? And they all want to pull water out of storage at the same time. Does the existing system have the capacity under that kind of an operational scenario? And they had to do a lot of modeling to answer those questions. And Director Cook, I would certainly defer to you in terms of how the system use agreement for wheeling cap water would or would not apply. And with Bartlett, of course, SRP is also, and Central Arizona Project are considering a interconnection between SRP and CAP that would, in part, be helpful for movement of additional stored Verde River water instead of just the Salt River supply.
So the reason I thank you for your question, Mr. Luff, because that allowed me to kind of build on that a little bit. It's important, again, for our committee and our board to understand that we don't know what projects we might develop yet. Some of them, it's possible, may have, like the Poseidon plant, to develop their own discharge and distribution system, which would be, I guess, belong to that project somehow. But it's also probably more likely that we will find ourselves using somebody else's infrastructure that's already there, that already has users. Then those systems and those users may or may not have contractual arrangements for how a newcomer and their water are treated in that infrastructure. They may have something in place, but that may or may not contemplate what it is that we might want to do. So to me, at least, it reinforces this idea is let's look what other people are doing. Let's get an advisory group together, and some of whom, certainly from Bartlett and from CAP, would have some history that they could share with it, do's and don'ts type of thing. And you use those inputs on how we might approach this off-taking in a way that can satisfy everyone's needs. And of course, there will be folks who are not off takers that are going to be looking out for making sure that their interest in that infrastructure is not impaired in some way.
Thank you, Director Cook. So let's see, we were just starting on the Central Arizona project. We included it just because it seemed like it would be noticeably absent if it weren't included, but it did evolve from the original construction of the federal project. And we also think it's illustrative in the sense that people have already talked about the possibility of either having new supply being directly delivered if and when there's capacity available in the CAP system, or doing it by exchange, where they would supply a new water supply to an existing Colorado River water user in exchange for a like amount of water being delivered through the CAP system. So, of course, any of these proposals would require compliance with NEPA and with the CAP system use policies. So, and that is what we put together in terms of illustrative examples. Hopefully they were illustrative, and I'll turn it back over to Director McGuire.
Thank you.
So I don't want to presume that there isn't any additional discussion or questions from the committee given that information and how it impacts WIFA's approach to this process. So I will, of course, defer to additional questions or thoughts before we begin into the resolution.
Do we have any hands raised from the online participants?
Yeah.
Okay. What about our in-person committee members? Anything further? Eyes fill out.
I see water. Like I say, you can have it up in the reservoir, but if it can't get down to the municipalities, and electricity is suffering the same problems right now, and they've maxed out their transmission. That's why there's being billions of dollars spent now in transmission, and this will eventually become a problem here because the water's not always where we need it, and you can have all kinds of credits in a reservoir, but if you can't get it to where the end users. So anyway, but thank you, Director Cook. I know you have lots of experience with water, but I do appreciate the explanation, because it will become a problem.
Well, given that, let's bring us to the resolution that we have placed before this committee. So as I noted earlier, our off-taker engagement it's not that we have not done any off-taker engagement, but this resolution would direct WIFA staff to engage with off-takers with the explicit purpose of developing an off-take agreement. So if you look at the timeline on the slide, November of 2023 was when our needs assessment happened. Last September, we also reached back out to the respondents of the needs assessment and essentially said, now that we've talked about how we're going to go about this competitive development process, is anything raising red flags? Is there anything you want to contribute to that? March of 2025, if this committee approves the resolution before it today, we'll begin sort of that true engagement, intentional engagement with the purpose of developing an off-take agreement. And that's what the resolution directs WIFA staff to do, to engage in all activities needed to develop an off-take agreement. In particular, the resolution directs us to begin engaging intentionally and formally with potential off-takers. As you've heard from Blaine, as we saw in many of the case studies, we anticipate that will take the form of a working group, that we would use the discussion we've just had to inform the contours of that group. But ultimately, and just to kind of level set, making sure we're talking over the course of months here, right? Not days. We will bring to this committee a form of offtake agreement with the input of all of those engaged stakeholders at varying forms of input, varying levels of commitment, as we saw on the ladder. I do want to note, however, when we talk about off-taker engagement, that is distinct from public stakeholder engagement more generally. I think we use the term stakeholders to kind of mean anybody who is interested, anybody who may have a part to play. All of those opinions and thoughts and input, it's very necessary, and WIFA is creating intentional processes for that to come into play. When we're talking about off-taker engagement, that is a specific kind of engagement with a specific purpose of developing that off-take agreement. It does not, it is parallel to, but it does not preclude, and absolutely will not preclude, additional public engagement. So when we're talking with folks who maybe are not likely purchasers of water, but still have very important input on the process, this does not mean we are excluding them. This simply means that we are creating a process with a very specific goal, creating an offtake agreement, to happen in parallel with all of the other feasibility analysis, public assessment that we're doing when it comes to the long-term water augmentation project. So with that, Mr. Chair, if there are no questions from the committee, if there is no additional input on the resolution itself, we will entertain a form of a motion to approve the resolution that has been provided in board materials.
Thank you, Director McGuire. Before we ask for a motion on the resolution, and a draft resolution was included in the committee packet for today. It was sent out to the committee members ahead of time, and it's also been available to the public. But I did have one question, I think, for General Counsel Satelli on some of the language in the resolution itself. All of the recitals kind of make the case that Director McGuire was just discussing, that we really need to have a process in place to develop a form of an agreement that that all the parties that are likely to participate in such an agreement can agree to. And then the resolution itself focuses on the committee giving direction to staff to start such a process that will culminate in a draft form of offtake agreement that could come to this committee and possibly be taken by this committee and recommended for approval by the WIFA board. So that being the case, number 5, I can't read it from here. I guess I could get on my screen. Yeah, I've got it. It says, no offtake agreement shall be binding or effective unless recommended for approval by the committee and subsequently approved by the authority's board of directors. I think the offtake agreement itself, when we get to that point, that goes without saying, that has to be executed in order to be in effect. But I think what we really mean here is no draft form of offtake agreement shall be effective. So that means we have to go through this process before we have one that everyone agrees on, and this committee and the board approve it, and then it's a thing that we can use. If the legal counsel wants to leave the words offtake agreement in there for belt and suspenders, I suggest that we say no offtake agreement or draft form of offtake agreement shall be binding or effective, so that it's clear that we're talking about both the form of and the final agreements themselves. It's kind of in the weeds.
No, I think it's a great comment and a good clarification. So just to clarify that change, to the extent that there is one, would just reiterate that before we even have approved of a form of agreement, that would go through a layer of committee and board sign off, and then would be obviously presented for parties to discuss, negotiate, sign, and obviously we would again bring back a final offtake agreement again for committee review and consideration before going to the board. So I think that's appropriate and consistent with the direction that staff had put in here. But I'll let Director McGuire respond if she has anything else.
No, I think she's covered it well. Mr. Tomier just had his hand up.
Okay, Mr. Tomier, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a brief comment, because I want to explain what my interests are in this role as a WIFA board member versus my day job with a potential off-taker of the future. And I've been in communication with the director and with the attorney just to make sure we're clear that I'm tracking any potential conflict of interest. I'm stating this for the public record. And as it pertains to this particular resolution, which is to initiate a process, I do not have a conflict of interest on providing such a direction. However, I will be very cautious and perhaps abstaining or maybe even removing myself entirely from the off-taker agreement process at some point when it comes down to potential language where there might be discussion of how much risk is borne by WIFA versus risk borne by an off-taker. Things of that nature. As this gets further down the process, I could end up in a conflict of interest. I will declare such and take appropriate action at that time. Thanks for the chance to just explain my positionality on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Tomir. We appreciate that a lot. This thoughtfulness. Any other comments or questions from committee members to the staff or the consultants before we consider a motion on the resolution? Do we have any public comments on this item?
We do, Mr. Cook. So there are 3 signed in to speak for public comment. I will note that the first 2, Barbara Chappell and Maxwell Wilson, I don't see you on the attendees list on Zoom. So if you are here, but just under a name or I don't see you, could you use the raise hand feature just so that we can enable your mic and allow you to provide comments? I will note that both have signed in favor of the issue, but I will also be reading into the record comments from a participant who could not attend and let me know that ahead of time. We've done that before and said I would be happy to do so. So this comment is from Warren Tenney with the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. The comment is that AMWA supports the creation of a working group to facilitate development of an offtake agreement. AMWA represents 10 cities and towns in the Phoenix metropolitan area that collectively serve over half of Arizona's population, as well as countless businesses that power our state's economy. AMWA supported the creation of the Long-Term Water Augmentation Fund, and many of our members are interested in being off-takers to a future importation project. We appreciate WIFA's forward-looking effort of creating an informal working group to review and remedy any potential issues with offtake agreements as these agreements are developed. We hope the committee supports this effort. Barbara and Maxwell, if you are on the Zoom, raise your hand. Going once, going twice. Mr. Chair, that concludes our public comments.
Okay, one last call to the committee members ready.
And that's 073 with the recommendations by the chair.
What's it with incorporating the changes that is just
I got that. Mr. Chairman, I would move for the approval of resolution 2025-073 offtake amendment development long-term water augmentation committee with the recommendation to number 5 given by the chair. And I don't know if I need to say the word specific. Okay.
I think we're good on the record there. Thank you.
Do we have?
Sure, this is Pete Kim. I second.
Thank you. Do we have any committee member discussion prior to voting? Seeing none, with no further discussion, we will call for a vote. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstained? The motion passes. Okay, we can move on now to agenda item number 6, call to the public. This is the time for any additional public comments on any agenda item. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Have we received any requests from the public? I'm seeing the answer is no. We will move on to agenda item number 7, agenda development. This is the opportunity for members to identify any topics they would like to have placed on an agenda at a future meeting. Nothing right now. So I will blend this then into agenda item number 8, our next meeting. We do not have one scheduled currently, but I would point everyone back to committee members and the public to Director McGuire's comments earlier about the staff commitment and the expectation of the committee to have periodic updates, even during this confidential procurement phase that we are in. So I'll go out on a limb and say probably as we move toward the offer phase, which is not too far away from now, that would probably be the next time that we would meet. So be expecting, I'll be discussing that with Director McGuire about the timing, and we'll attempt to get something on our calendar. And I'm estimating that will be the next month and a half or so.
That is a decent estimate, I think, Chairman Cook. I would also mention for this committee that given the number of submissions and given the complexity of the process, there may be a need for an amendment to the solicitation schedule relatively quickly, just given what we now know and what we're dealing with. So a few weeks is probably a generous assessment, but we will keep this board and this committee apprised of that. If an amendment is issued, that we will be giving notification of that at the next, probably the next board meeting will be the next time all of us are together. So, but yes, you are correct in your assessment that the offer will be the next time at which there's more publicly available information.
Okay, thank you. And just to remind everyone that amendments can be anything from a ministerial change that the staff can do by themselves, or something substantive that would have to come to this committee and then the board, and that those might be urgent enough that we'd have to do that with a fairly quick turnaround. So if that type of thing happens, we will give as much notice as possible.
I will note that a solicitation schedule amendment would not be one of those situations. We have done that several times in this current current solicitation. But yes, you are absolutely correct.
Okay. Any other discussion on agendas or future meetings? We'll move on to agenda item number 9, our adjournment. If there's nothing else, we will adjourn this meeting of the WIFA Long-Term Augmentation Committee. The time is now 2:21 p.m. We are adjourned.